guys, welcome back to The Cue, the audio course where we define our mixing tools and we refine our skills. In this video, we're continuing our three-part mini-series all about EQ, and today's episode is all about the high-pass filter. Now, you'll remember from last time that EQ is a tool that allows us to adjust the volume of specific frequency ranges of an audio signal. One special filter that we have as part of our EQ toolkit is the high-pass filter, and this is actually one of the most powerful tools on any audio console. A high-pass filter attenuates or cuts off frequencies below a set point. On older analog desks, this was typically around 80 or 100 hertz, but now with digital consoles, we can adjust that high-pass filter all the way up to 500 hertz, or in this case, all the way up to 2000 hertz. And this is useful because it removes all of this low-frequency content that can muddy up your mix. This is such an important control for us that we're going to dedicate the rest of this episode to going through instruments one by one. So first up, let's take a listen to our track that we're using for this mix. Disclaimer, this is a raw track without any high-pass filter or EQ or compression or gates. This is no processing, just the raw recording. So let's take a listen.
I've got one response. I've got just one move. With my arms stretched wide, I will worship you. So I throw up my hands and praise you again and again.
Now, before we go through each instrument, let's start off with just how to use the high-pass filter. So on the board here, we have just one knob for the high-pass filter, and the only thing this adjusts is the frequency where it starts cutting out. So right now I've got it set for 145, so this means that you can see the slope there, so there's a little bit of a gradual slope, but it's going to cut out basically everything below 145 hertz. Now that we know what it does, before we go through each instrument, let's get an example of how we're going to use the high-pass filter as we go through. So we'll start with the acoustic guitar here. I'm going to play a little bit, and then I'm going to bring the high-pass filter up. Now, what you're listening for is when does the instrument start to sound unnatural? And then once we get there, we'll start to bring it back down until it sounds fully natural. Let's take a listen. So there it sounds pretty bad. So let's bring it back down. So I might land anywhere between 92 and 145. Still sounded pretty natural. But you get a little bit more warmth out of it if you bring it down to 92. So this is actually one case where as I'm mixing, the acoustic guitar is an instrument that I'll go to and I'll adjust the high-pass filter during the worship set. I'll tend to roll it up to 145, 130 while the band is really big and supporting. But when it's just the worship leader out front with just an acoustic guitar, that's a moment where I might roll that high-pass filter down, warm up the guitar when it's just the guitar and vocals. So that sounds pretty good in there. So let's leave it around 115, 112. And then let's go through the next instrument. Next up is going to be kick. Kick drum, you say? Why would we put a high-pass filter on the kick drum? Well, it can actually tighten up the kick just a little bit to have a high-pass filter way down. So let's take a listen. And now I'm going to engage the high-pass filter. It's hard to tell maybe on your speakers at home or on headphones, but if you've got a really good subwoofer, like in many of our rooms, it actually does make a little bit of a difference to cut out the frequencies that are below what the sub can accurately reproduce. But let's take it too high. It sounds like you're punching a paper bag, so that's too far. I like it around 30 on a kick drum. Let's move on though. Here's a snare. That feels too thin. Around 100 is not a bad place to live. Now snare bottom. Most of what we're looking for in the snare bottom is the actual attack of the snares, the crackle. So we don't need a lot of the low notes out of it. So around 200 probably sounds pretty good here. Hi-hats, he's not playing in this song very much, so we'll skip it, but I usually have it up pretty high to just get the wash sound of the hi-hat. You don't need any of the warmth because what you're cutting out in this range, I've got it 500, 522, we're cutting out all the fundamentals of the actual drum beats. So if we solo it, actually let's do that.
Yeah.
You can hear all the other instruments, including the kick and the snare, through your hi-hat mic. But when we hit the high-pass filter on it, that really greatly reduces how much you're hearing through that open mic. So drums is a great place to make sure you get your high passes right because it cuts out and lets the kick drum actually come through in the low end rather than trying to get kick drum through your hi-hat mic. So moving on to the rack tom, we found a spot where he's playing it. That feels too far. Right around 100 seems to seem natural for this tom. Let's move on to the floor tom. Now you'll notice we're getting a lot of bleed through from the other instruments in this section, but let's work on the high pass. So I'm only up to 180 and it already sounds more like a rack tom than a floor tom. So let's bring it back down. That seems good there. We get a little bit of the growl of the floor tom, so that's at 75. How about these overheads? So with overheads, there's kind of two schools of thought here. One is that you roll the high-pass filter all the way up and only get your cymbals. You use them as cymbals mics. The other is you leave it down lower and you can start to get some of the toms when they're playing quiet enough that they aren't opening the gate. This gets a little complicated, but let's just listen to our overhead left mic. So you can hear the toms there, so you can understand why you might use that because it sounds okay. But you're getting a lot of the kick drum in there as well. So let's start with a high pass filter all the way down and we'll roll it up. So as I got up to 2K, it really started to take away even the sound of the cymbal hit. So let's bring it back down until we hear the cymbals being hit nicely, but the rest of the drums are still going to sound a little odd. Yeah, around 500 seems to seem pretty natural if we want the cymbals to sound good here. So let's just do the same thing on our other overhead. I think we'll keep it there for the cymbals. Next up is bass. Now on the bass, same thing with the kick drum. If you have just a little bit of a high pass, it can make your subwoofers, which can't really create sounds below usually 30 or 20 or 30 hertz, depending on your subwoofer, it can make those work easier. And so it's nice to have just a little bit of high pass filter in some cases. So I'll just put it on at 20 hertz and we'll take a listen. Now if I roll it up, so it probably should be around 30 hertz. Next up is electric. Now with the electric, most of what I'm trying to do here is leave room for the bass guitar. So let's take a listen. I don't really want to lose the warmth of his tone though, so let's bring it back down. Now this guitar is playing pretty bright, so around 100 should feel pretty good. Moving back to the acoustic, we've already done that. Next up would be keys. So rolling this up. So you can start to hear, it still sounds pretty good, but you've lost some of the low-end warmth. And since we just listened to the electric that was much brighter, I like to keep the piano pretty warm so that that can feel like our warm bed, and then the electric can sit on top of that in terms of the tone. So I'll bring this back down. So now let's listen to the piano and the electric together, just so you can hear what I mean if they're in different frequency ranges. So the piano's got that warmth to it, but we're still cutting out the bottom of it so that there's room for the bass, and then the electric is sitting a little on top of that. Next up after the piano is the pads, and this is a spot where you can get really muddy in your mix if you're not careful. So I like to use my high pass filter quite a bit here. So let's just start with it all the way zeroed out and we'll listen. So most of the pretty tones are happening up in that higher range. There's a lot of warmth that's down low. That's nice when you're just listening to it on its own, but once we get the rest of the band in there, I'm worried that's going to create that mud that we're worried about. So I'll leave it up here around 300 hertz. Next up is vocals. We've got a male and female vocalist on this track. We're going to start with the male vocal.
I've got one response. I've got just one move. With my arms stretched wide.
So around there, it starts to sound too thin. Let's bring back some of the warmth of his voice.
So I throw up my hands and praise you again and again. 'Cause all that I have is a hallelujah.
Maybe something around there. And then let's go to the female vocal.
I know it's not much, but I'm nothing else fit for a king, except for a heart singing hallelujah.
That's too far again.
Hallelujah.
So I'll bring the female vocal up a little bit higher. Now the last thing is we are using some tracks here in addition to the live instruments. So I usually just roll those up and leave some room for the live instruments. So we'll go quickly. We've got some tracked bass here. I've got this a little bit higher than our regular bass, but I don't want to take too much out, otherwise it won't seem like a bass. Next up is a track guitar. Again, that's a little bit higher than my electric guitar. Here's another pad next. That's pretty high. Next is a strings track. I don't want to lose too much of the low end of the strings, so I'm going to keep it a little lower, 120. Now these drums, I've got these rolled up pretty high to get a little bit of the crackle of the snare in it, and maybe a little bit of the cymbal, but I don't want any of the kick drum interfering with my live kick drum, so I've got it up a bit. That'll add a little bit of character to the drums, but it's not going to compete with my live drums because I've got it rolled up enough. Now, let's just go back and listen to this mix. I'm going to turn on all the high-pass filters, and we'll just listen to it with only high-pass filters on all these channels, and then we'll turn them off again, and then turn them on one more time. Take a listen to this.
So I throw up my hands and praise you again and again. 'Cause all that I have is a hallelujah, hallelujah. And I know it's not much, nothing else fit for a king.
So you can hear just having the high-pass filter enabled has cleaned up the mix dramatically. Again, we don't have any other processing on this mix yet. It's just a high-pass filter, and it already sounds much cleaner. So you can imagine once we get everything else right, it's going to really come together. But the high-pass filter is always step one for me. After I get my gain right, high-pass filter is always step one to creating a clean and compelling mix. So we've defined the high-pass filter today. Get out there and refine your skills.